So welcome back after the lunch break to the second session of Unexpected Lesson, Decolonizing Nature. We're going to proceed with this session with an input by Chao Tayiana Maina, who, as you know, could not be here today with us due to visa issues, but she will participate at least digitally, which does not substitute her physical presence here in this room. But anyway, I'm happy to have her via Zoom. Chao Tayiana Maina is a historian, a headstrong historian. She founded African Digital Heritage and also the initiative Open Restitution Africa, which actually just launched a very, very interesting podcast. Maybe she will talk about it. So I'm happy. I'm welcoming, I don't know where to look at because she's like virtually with us, Chao for her input.
Thank you, Isabel. I think I am everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Such is the nature of the internet. But I must begin by saying thank you very much to the tech team as well. Live streams are not the easiest thing to pull off. And so even though I cannot see you, I am with you and I thank you. I'm going to be talking today about the intersection of landscape and memory. Now, when I was in school, my mom would always say this thing that went like, if you plant maize, you get maize. And she would always refer to this in kind of relation to my education, in a system where your results and your examinations determined everything about your life. She would always say that whatever you reap, you will sow. And so it's in this very interesting intersection of planting and reaping that I also became a product of the Kenyan education system. And so I was a maize cob, a young budding maize cob that was planted by the Kenyan education system, which inherently is a colonial education system. Now, when I first decided to become, or rather when I started my practice as a historian, I was very much rooted or rather oriented to the kind of ways in which I was taught that history should exist. It should exist in books, newspapers. It definitely should exist in written form. And without a doubt, African history began only with European intervention. And so this practice of growing in my career, in my journey, in my purpose for me has always involved a lot of unlearning, not just as an individual, but also in the methods that I use and collaborating as well with such brilliant African scholars and African minds who have enabled us to really challenge the boundaries of the ways in which we see ourselves. Now, I talk about landscape and memory today because I believe that we're talking about anti-colonial approaches to nature. And one of the things that I feel very strongly is around what we use as a historical record. And in this intervention, I will be positing that landscape in itself is an archive and landscape is a historical record in and of itself. Now, the question is, how does that intersect with human memory? I believe that the past is not, landscape, just like the past, just like our memories, is not static. It shifts and it changes and it moves forward and sometimes it moves backward. And sometimes it moves slowly and sometimes it moves fast. And so in this way, in several conversations I have had with colleagues, but also with my family and particularly my grandparents, I became very intrigued around the ways in which landscape can be both an agent of preservation, an agent of change that connects the visual, the physical, and the cultural elements of our memory making. And so I have a couple of questions for myself, but also for you. What are some of the links that exist between, for example, landscape and oral history? How do we pass this information down from generation to generation? We had a very excellent talk from Harriet, who demonstrated the ways in which Indigenous knowledge and oral history is not is something that is living. It's not something that we should be othering, but something that we should be paying a lot of attention to. And how can we explore really alternative ways of understanding our history, our environment, our ecosystems in relation to the land. Now, my first kind of entry point into this conversation is around archives and the relationship between, as I mentioned at the beginning, the written record and particularly if you're coming from a colonial creation or a nation that has inherited largely a colonial mindset and foundation. Now, where does my education come from and who is educating me? And that is a question. They do say that learning is a lifelong mission. And for me, I remember one conversation I had with my grandfather, and we're talking about the colonial education system. And he said something that I don't think I will ever forget. He said to me, the only reason that the white people, the Europeans, educated us in their system and in their culture was so that we could work for them, and two, we could understand what they meant when they called us idiots. And so I remember speaking with him around what it meant to be a child in the 1950s and to be one of the first generation that encountered colonial education systems. And we started speaking about oral history, and we started speaking about landscape, particularly in relation to the Maasai community. And a very fascinating conversation ensued around how, as a community, we have names of places and how these names of places are essentially invaluable repositories of geographical information, scientific information, and sociocultural knowledge. So what does it mean when you move from accessing archives that are essentially to you, but not about you rather, but not with you? And what does it mean to kind of not just challenge the archive, but explore another form of archiving entirely? I feel like self-representation, self-identification is essential to the quest for freedom. And in this regard, the archival record is not something that sits on a pedestal and cannot be challenged, but it must be brought down to the present, deconstructed, challenged, and imagined. And so that begins my kind of first exploration into language, landscape, and memory. Now, in our first Unexpected Lessons Nairobi intervention, we did have a section on Nairobi street names, and we deconstructed how several street names, particularly Nairobi Central Business District, had gotten their names. And it was a fascinating conversation to have online and amongst kind of peers and social events. And I started thinking about the ways in which many towns, many cities and urban centers in Kenya are named after names derived from the Maasai community. And in this exploration, I was exploring both place and meaning, and the ways in which landscape can really unravel layers of memory which have been transmitted across generations, from generation to generation. What I found when I began this exploration of trying to understand where did many towns in Kenya that we know of today get their names, and what do these names mean? I realized that place names, especially from the Maasai community, can be divided into 4 or so categories. So places can be named after minerals, after the kind of soil that is found in this location, after the climate in this location. Place names can also be based on plant species and descriptions of the vegetation of the area. Place names are also based on color and the general aesthetic of the landscape. And last but not least, place names are also based on physical features, characteristics such as ponds, lakes, rivers, etc. So I will share some examples and forgive kind of the pixelation of the images. One of the places that is adjacent to Nairobi is called Limuru. And this translates to a a species of a plant in Maasai known as Ilmorog. And this is now typically used in many places. I think here in Kenya, we call it Kai apple. I'm not sure what the scientific name is, but it's a plant that is commonly used for fencing. Another place that is adjacent to Nairobi, which translates to a forested area in Maasai, and these names have evolved over time. What's interesting is some of these places are not, where there were forests, they're not forests anymore. And so we can begin to tell, just by understanding the meanings of place names, we can begin to tell stories of ecological change. We can begin to look at migration patterns. We can even begin to look at environmental degradation and things like global warming from a historical perspective. There's another place called Kileleshwa, which is essentially a plant that was traditionally used as a sort of perfume and deodorant. And the place derives its name from this plant. Now, within the kind of Kenyan linguistics and syntax, we really don't have an understanding of the ways in which many of the place names originated. And so through this exercise, I was trying to really have a strong relationship between community, between the way communities lived in the environments and were observers and part of the environment, and the ways in which that has been inherited today and the ways in which it has also been forgotten. So this is a center, let me say center, an urban estate called Buruburu, which is also a Maasai word meaning small pond. I can assure you there is no small pond in Buruburu today, but it also kind of points us in the direction of understanding where natural and ecological features existed that don't exist anymore. We can be able to trace this through through place names. Now, the final place is a place called Ngong, where I come from. And the original Maasai name for this translates to the place where the pond where rhinos drink, or the pool of the rhino. It's interesting because Ngong is now an urban center. It is almost unthinkable to imagine a rhino in the locality, but we can also begin to kind of trace animal patterns and animal migrations over time by virtue of understanding the ways in which places have been named. Places are also named not just after physical characteristics, but what they were used for. And so this lake at the Abadeas called Lake Olbolosat was a place of sacrifice and a place of worship traditionally, and that is what the name refers to. And so here we see another element in which we see the dynamic between the language, the practice, the landscape, and memory. Another place, finally, being Mount Kenya, which in Maasai is known as a striped mountain because of the glaciers. Now we can begin to see that these names are not just, they're not just names, you know, they are very telling of the ways in which communities have existed for a very long time, for centuries within their environments. One thing that I find interesting about this work and about this exercise is that it's not just limited to the Maasai community. We can extend these data sets far and wide across Kenya, but in the ways in which through kind of the formal, very colonial education system, we were not taught or were not even equipped as children with the capacity to interrogate what do these places mean. And I think it's beautiful that even against the onslaught of all this violence, that both our ancestors, our grandparents, and our forefathers and mothers have been able to preserve and communicate such vital pieces of information of the historical record, but also in enabling us to chart paths to the future through the work, through work such as this. Now, from that exploration of kind of language and place names, I also started thinking about the intersection between what is visible and what is not. So what happens when a place where there was a watering pool for rhinos is suddenly a sprawling urban centers with not a watering pool in sight? If you cannot see it, did it exist? And if we do not understand the meaning of the name, then we do not understand what existed in the land before we came. Now, this kind of other line of thought brought me to the town of Jamestown in Accra, the center of Jamestown in Accra, and a project known as Hidden Histories by Dr. Stephen Collins and Nick Waterley. In it, I was thinking about the ways in which Jamestown is not as well known in terms of its links to slavery as sites such as Elmina Castle or Cape Coast. In their project, Nick Waterley and Stephen Collins realized by interviewing members of the community in Jamestown that people did not believe that Jamestown was an essential part of the slave trade because there were no kind of existing forts or evidence of historical preservation of the sites of slavery as in other places. The interesting thing about Jamestown is that it was also kind of a town in which slaves were being transported underground from building to building to avoid the payment of taxes. And so when it comes to memorialization, people don't see the tunnels, people don't see the record in the landscape. And therefore this leads to people saying that, well, Jamestown was not as involved as other places. When there are no chains and there are no shackles, how does language and how does memory give back to the landscape? Because sometimes the landscape is giving to us what we do not know. And other times we need to give back to the landscape what has been erased, what has been hidden, and what has been forgotten. I think that landscape is changing and our memories are changing with it. It's one thing to imagine that landscape will stay constant within our lifetimes, but in multiple lifetimes, things change rapidly. And so I would like us to collectively interrogate and think about the place of landscapes within our collective understanding, the meaning of names, the meaning of place names, particularly in Indigenous languages. What does that tell us about the historical record? What does that tell us about our present day interactions with the environment as a continuing engagement with the land itself? I'm not sure how much time I have, sorry, I can't see, but I think that's the end of my presentation. I'll end then and perhaps have time for some questions.